Today, you're going to learn how to turn a good conversation into a great one and keep that conversational ball rolling. You'll learn the art of asking great follow-up questions. This is a 3-part mini class on how to have a great conversation with virtually anybody. Previous video in this series is asking questions around the 4 F's. That's the best way to get some momentum going in conversations. The key issue for this lesson is, where do you go from there? You don't want to turn this into a one-way interview or interrogation. That can come across as too aggressive and it'll turn some people off. We need to let the conversation breathe and flow naturally. And I want to emphasize again that the goal of good conversations is to learn, to get to know people, transcend differences, find common ground, and build relationships. And that means a large part of the conversation should feel fairly free-form. In that light, we'll look at 3 ways to handle the middle of a conversation. First, once you've asked them questions around the 4 F's and the other person's talking, you should go mostly into active listening mode. This will keep the conversation flowing naturally. I have a bunch of videos on listening, so I'm not going to repeat all of the details here, but I will summarize. Good active listening is listening genuinely, not faking it, making eye contact, nodding once in a while, making sure you have an attentive and warm facial expression. You should also say little things that we call back channel cues like, yeah, I hear you. This shows that you're following along and understanding the other person without interrupting. Simply paying close attention and listening carefully plays a major part in being a great conversationalist. If you listen like this, one of the most common results will be that the other person continues to talk because they're so thrilled that someone's actually listening well to them. Every excellent conversationalist I know is a wonderful listener. Now, in contrast, some of us like to jump in and respond at length to everything the other person says. Maybe we get excited about what they're saying and we want to join in on that fun. But what I'm saying is simply listening is one of the best ways to keep the other person engaged and let the conversation flow naturally. I found a quotation that's credited to the writer Ernest Hemingway. I don't know if he actually said it, but it sounds like him. It takes 2 years to learn to speak and 60 to learn to keep quiet. And that's mostly what listening is about. You're paying attention and being mostly quiet to give the other person room to continue speaking. And here's another quotation I recently saw about listening from an author, David Oxburg. Being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they're almost indistinguishable. I shared that quotation with my wife the other day, who's a mental health therapist. About 90% of her occupation is listening. And she 100% agreed with this quotation. Listening attentively is typically all the encouragement the other person will need to keep talking. But at some point, you'll want to take your own talking turn. And you can do this by asking follow-up questions or making your own statements. So second, let's start with asking follow-up questions. This is really the 5th secret F that adds to the 4 F's we talked about in the last lesson. Follow-up questions are the vehicle for most conversations that we have when we're not even trying. I like to imagine that everything they have already said in the conversation is a helpful jumping off place. It's information that I could potentially ask more questions about in a natural way. The longer you talk to the other person, the more data you have to ask follow-up questions. If we break it down moment by moment, here's how it looks. Let's say I'm using the first of the 4 F's and I'm asking the other person questions about where they're from. They tell me they currently live in New York, but they're originally from Michigan. I could ask them a follow-up question about what they just said. What brought you to New York? If they just told me I came here for my job, but I also have some family in the area, that gives me more information to ask about. Where do you work? Or what's your occupation? I could ask them, how long have you been in that profession? What do you like about that career? I could ask them, how did you get into that line of work? Or based upon the original answer, when they mentioned that they also have family in the area, I could ask them, tell me more about your family in New York. Or how far do you live from your family? How often do you get to see them? Follow-up questions are the perfect way to keep the conversation going because you are, by definition, talking about what they brought up. It's what they want to talk about. In contrast, you're not abruptly changing the subject or quickly making it about you. Most people love talking about themselves, and you're giving them the opportunity to do that. It's a gift to ask people real questions, listen to their answers, and ask follow-up questions. The great thing about follow-up questions is that they work well for somebody you just met, somebody you already know well, and even somebody you haven't seen for a while. So let's say you run into a coworker, and last time you saw them, they were about to take a trip to Colorado to go skiing. You could ask them a follow-up question. How was your trip? And you pick up the conversation right where you left off. They'll be impressed that you remembered and be complimented that you cared enough to follow up. The third way to keep the conversation going is to make statements of your own. That's the key to having a natural conversation. You're talking about what's already been said so far in the conversation. So when you chime in, don't change the subject too quickly, in other words. Instead, make the kind of statements that build common ground and align with the current subject. Going back to the earlier example, if they just shared with you why they moved to New York, you might ask a couple of follow-up questions about that, but then you may offer your own reason, your own contribution about why you moved to New York. If they've been telling you a little bit about their career and how they got into it, you could share a little bit about your career and what made you choose that direction. But the idea here is to mix things up. At times, ask follow-up questions. At other times, offer information about yourself. This will create a natural flow of conversation, common ground, and will prevent it from feeling like an interview or a one-sided interrogation. Now, if you jump in too quickly before they finish what they're saying, or feel compelled to share every little bit of common ground you sense in real time, you'll be jumping in every 2 seconds. This happens sometimes even with the best of intentions because people get excited when they find similarities and they want to immediately point that out and acknowledge it. But I'm suggesting to practice patience and let the other person talk a little while. Let the conversation breathe. In the course of time, after you've listened really well, then you can offer some information about yourself that shows common ground. So let's talk about taking action. In your next conversation, you can, of course, start by asking questions about any of the 4 F's that we talked about in the last video. But once the conversation gets rolling along, that's where you listen carefully, ask follow-up questions, and make your own statements that naturally correspond to what the other person has already been saying. Look for common ground. Stick to the subjects that you know the other person is already interested in. Let's take a quick look at a summary. You'll notice on the surface that each of these skills look fairly basic in print, but seeing them on screen and actually doing them well yourself are 2 different realities. There's a real art to each of these skills when you're in the moment with the other person. The real measure of learning and growth is not just hearing me talk about it, but practicing this yourself in real life. Now, there's one more video in this series. This is part 3, but part 4 is only going to be included in the fully stitched together version of this class. So if you happen to be watching this video on its own, you can find a link in the description to that longer video and then skip ahead to the 4th part. And that lesson will be answering some of the most common questions and obstacles people face when they're having conversations the way we've been talking about. Until next time, thanks, God bless, and I will see you soon.